Hi everyone, this is Lauren coming at you from the break zone with some pre-release reveals. The pre-releases are going on now, right now in New Zealand, Australia, and they're going to be rolling out throughout the world as the day goes on. Today being Saturday, and I'm going to go ahead and give you some reveals. So I'm going to try to go over just about every card that has that's part of the set. I'm going to start off with Fire. This one being Ward. I'm going to give you a little bit of the thoughts I have about the cards and how they fare in terms of the other formats, mainly constructed, but also in sealed because it looks like, I'm really happy for it actually that Square Enix and Hobby Japan has started to focus a little bit more on sealed. And hopefully they've been able to balance things out, but there's also themes. So normally with Final Fantasy, you're used to seeing things like categories. So when you play title series, you can look over here and you can see this one is Pictologia and 8. And the thing about it is Pictologia doesn't normally count. So anything that's like Dissidia, Final Fantasy, Pictologia, Theater Rhythm, anything like that doesn't technically count as a main category for title series. But 8 does. And so there's different things that kind of work out for in terms of sealed. Normally you want to see what element it is, such as like fire. And other than that, you also want to see, well, can it fit pretty well in certain themes, such as, you could call it tribal. So it's similar jobs. So this one being a warrior or being a category, for example, 8, it would fit with other, it might have bonuses from other, let's say, 8 characters, and or maybe things that give boost to warriors, this one being warriors. So, for example, Ward, I think, is going to be pretty good in when you talk about constructed, you'll be able to give all job warrior forwards plus 2,000 power. So that includes the Opus 1 2 cost 5,000 power warrior of light, whose job is warrior, and would be able to give it a 2,000 power boost, which will get doubled when in combat with forwards of cost 4 or more. So instead of being 5,000, it's going to go up to 7,000, which can trade up to, like 14,000. And if you do anything like power boost and everything, so technically with Ward and maybe let's say a Lebro, you would be able to give a Warrior of Light, the 2 CP one, like plus 3,000 power altogether, 2 from Ward, plus 1 more from Lebro. And at that point, you have a 2 cost AK, which is very efficient. Normally, you see the 7,000 power, I guess you could say baseline, go more for 3 CP. And I think Ward is going to go hand in hand with things that, for example, Fire seems to be having a theme where it's giving boost to 2 CP forwards. So later on, if you remember, Godot from Opus 5 is able to give plus 2,000 power to forwards of cost of exactly 2. So if you were to have Ward and Godot, you could definitely make a deck that's themed around 2 CP fire forwards, especially if you want to use the Warrior of Light that I mentioned already. And if you use that in conjunction with, on top of having the 4 cost Phoenix that brings back a 4 CP forward, then you could recur that. I think that's going to be pretty good. When you want to talk about sealed, I think War is going to be good because it's on curve. It's an AK body, which is pretty relevant. I mean, normally it's kind of hard to deal with larger forwards, AK and higher. And at AK, he's perfectly on curve. And there were some standard units before in previous sets when you played sealed, where 8 power was just exactly what you needed. So you'd pay 4 cost AK and you'd be pretty happy. So one of the reasons why I'm going over sealed is because sealed is actually going to be one of the formats that's going to be played at Gen Con. So you want to start considering about which cards are good for sealed. And also the fact that you could actually qualify for the North America Championship by winning those tournaments. So maybe when you go to your organized play and your LGS, your local game stores, you'll want to consider practicing for Gen Con because a qualification and a 3-round bye can be very big when we talk about competition. So after Ward, we're going to go over with the second fire card being Garland. I think Garland's pretty good. We're talking about a 5 drop 9k, and there's definitely some job princesses and job knights that come to mind, and there's a couple of job knights that come into mind when you're talking about the Final Fantasy IX package, as well as having Garnet be a princess as well. So if you were to do the Water Fire Knights, Garland might be able to fit in there, be able to give your knight forwards the Brave bonus. And I mean, otherwise, he's not that useful. I mean, definitely the special abilities are pretty cool, but you might not want to have too many copies of Garland to begin with. Otherwise, it would be pretty helpful. But when you want to talk about sealed, 9k is a pretty big deal. It's hard to deal with, especially when it's attacking. So if you're able to get Garland out and do that, then that would be great. I don't think there's any job princesses. I could be wrong in this set, so you might not be able to count it for sealed. If I'm wrong, go ahead and correct me and start using it for that. But otherwise, it would be a good option in Waterfire Knights. Next up, we've got Guy. I'm trying to remember at what point I'm supposed to talk about Furion. I think Furion's coming up anyways. But next I've got Guy, and I think Guy's really good. He's on curve, and I mean, the fact that he has Brave is pretty good. And he also gets power boost for any category 2 characters, including the Maria backup. So with Maria backup, Guy would actually be 3 cost 9k. So I think that's pretty relevant. On top of the fact that he'll be able to reactivate your all forwards you control. So there's definitely some tricks you can pull with that. Where, for example, Guy, let's see, you would be able to attack with Guy into like Rinoas and kind of things like that, and reactivate all your forwards. And he's also good for blocking as long as you're not trying to block Rinoa. If you block Rinoa with Guy, what's going to happen is that since the Rinoa is the attacker, means that your opponent is the active turn player. At that point, the auto abilities will go on the stack. Their auto abilities will go on the stack first, meaning Rinoa's dual ability will go on the stack first. And Guy's ability to activate all your forwards will go on top of that, thus resolving first, meaning that all your forwards will activate, and then Rinoa will resolve and dull all of them. So make sure you don't use Guy to, you don't try to use Guy to activate all your forwards by blocking a Rinoa, because that's not going to be ideal. I mean, I'm sure there's other ways to go about it, such as, for example, having the Rinoa attack and then block her and break her, and that way all your forwards will be dull, and then using some kind of special trick to break Guy after Rinoa's effect is resolved in order to activate all your forwards and hopefully swing the tide. Next up, we've got Kiros. So Kiros to draw 5k and able to work really well with category 8 forwards. I'm not loving this card because the effect that only happens when Kiros enters the field. So that's kind of like a summon with a forward that comes out into play during your turn. I mean, it does work with Ward, so that's pretty cool though. And it also works with Godot, which is nice, so that's definitely a theme to it. But you really have to kind of build your deck around it if you want to go in that direction. On the other hand, category 8 forwards is pretty specific to get all the bonuses from Kiros when it enters the field. So it'll work well with Ward, though, as I mentioned earlier, as Ward is a category 8 forward, and giving first strike, haste, and brave. I mean, at that point, that means to get the full effect, including the haste, you would have to be playing Ward and Kiros in the same turn. So we're talking about a lot of cards at that point. I mean, Ward is 4 cost, Kiros is 2, so you'll have to be able to spend 6 CP to play both of them. If we're talking about using the cards in your hand, discarding for CP in order to do so, that's going to be 3 cards, including those 2 cards being in your hand. So that's a 5-card hand, which is quite difficult. If you're talking about backups, then definitely that helps. If you have 2 or 4 backups, then it would be very helpful. But it's a very niche card, and I would definitely put more copies of Ward than Kiros if I were to go in that direction, unless your deck was stacked full of, well, even if your deck was stacked full of category 8 characters, this card is kind of iffy at times. And when it comes to sealed, this card is not great unless your deck has a lot of 8 characters. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get any bonus off of that. And if you don't have Ward, then this card becomes even less useful. Okay, next up we've got Illusionist. So Illusionist is well, it's okay. I mean, the fact that you play it out, you could definitely get, for example, so instead of being able to force your opponent, your forward from not blocking, for example, Illusionist is the opposite. By forcing your opponent to attack, you'll be able to force some of their forwards that might not have certain abilities that can they can use the turn they come into play, enters the field, and force them to attack so that you can take him out. But keep in mind, it's not going to work with the Emperor because the Emperor is going to be able to shut down all activated and special abilities. But it's, I guess you could say, as I mentioned earlier, you could use it in conjunction with the Red Mage from Opus 1 to force your opponent into kind of funny situations where forwards that they thought would be good for blocking will no longer be able to do so because they're attacking. Keep in mind, it's not going to be great against Brave, and the effect will most likely fizzle if they have an activated ability that forces them to duel that they can use at the time. And the fact that Illusionist has to go into your break zone makes it a very tricky card. I would definitely, if I were trying to clear the way for my forwards, I would opt to use the Opus 1 Red Mage instead, or maybe I think it was called a Ninja to be able to prevent a block. On the other hand, in Sealed, it's a 2-cost backup, and sometimes opening up the, I guess you could say, since you don't have access to Red Mage or Ninja in Sealed for Opus 6, it'd be kind of nice to force your opponent to kind of open up their defenses, their blockers, so that you can get through with smaller forwards. And this might be able to help you do so, but it does come at a cost. Okay. All right, next up we've got, hold on, let me see. 6. Oh, whoops. Okay. We've got Evoker. So Evoker is pretty cool, especially in Sealed. So in Constructed, we're all aware of what Evoker does, and it hasn't been used as much, at least not for Fire, because you don't get that many boosts from having multiple backups, except for, I think it's the Vermilion Bird C Katuna from Opus 5. But normally you don't want to fill up your backup slots with too many unbreakable backups unless you need the backups right away for things like Idea and Lightning. In this case, Fire doesn't get that many boosts normally from having multiple backups. There are certain cards that do take advantage of it, but you'd have to build your deck around it. So for Constructed, I don't really advise it. For Sealed, it's pretty good because it can technically act as a 2-cost backup or odd-cost backup if you really wanted to go in that route. So if you get Evoker first turn, you could pitch a card and be able to play it out, and that'll be your first backup, and it won't be like a 3-cost or 4-cost, so you don't have to discard as many cards to be able to play it out. So it's pretty nice, and there is a card in the set that takes advantage of having multiple 1-cost backup, and in this case, Evoker would be able to be used to do so. I think the card's like Sit 2 and Wind. Okay. Next up, we've got Cornelia. So Cornelia is a backup, a girl, and well, being able to give a power boost for 1 turn is pretty good. So if you play aggressively, it looks like this card would be pretty useful to you. Being able to give a power boost to your smaller forwards if you were to go in that route, and then building up your backups at the same time. So instead of a summon, you'll be able to give a smaller boost. So instead of having like a Belias in Constructed, for example, you'll be able to play out Cornelia to give a plus 1,000 power boost to all your forwards at the time and attack that turn. So that kind of helps out, but keep in mind that's very telegraphed. So it's not a combat trick. You have to play during your first main phase in order for it to work out for you during that turn. So your opponent would definitely be able to do easy calculations in terms of which blocks are effective. But you being able to return it to your hand to do it every turn, keep in mind, is going to cost you about pretty much 4 CP. So you'll have to duel Cornelia, use a Fire CP, and spend 2 more CP to be able to play her out. So that's kind of niche, and that's kind of nice. But if you go with the full route of getting the full effect in an efficient way, it's going to require you to have at least 2 fire backups, 1 backup of any element, and Cornelia in play for at least 1 turn to be able to do that, and then just keep doing it back to back. And that's kind of cool, but keep in mind that it can be quite costly to keep using that resource for just a 1000 power boost when you could spend 3 and have something like, let's say, a Lebro if you were to play Mono Fire, which would be good. But Cornelia is able to give a plus 1000 power boost to all your forwards, so there's a chance that he gets played. Next up, we've got Goblin. So Goblin, it's one of those monsters that costs 0 to activate. 2 CP, 5k, so that's not too bad. Choosing 1 forward, dealing 1000 damage, so technically it's a 2-drop 6k. I don't think it's that great, but if you use effects that can, for example, that require you to target damage forward. So we're talking about, for example, the Ramus that require you to deal a decent amount of damage, like 7k for the most part, to a damage forward. That's pretty cool, but that's very niche, and I don't really love this card, so I would probably not be using it much. And even in sealed, I don't love it too much, but sometimes you just need something that's able to dodge board wipes, and well, even then, unless you really need to fill a slot, I wouldn't really be using Goblin. All right. Next up, we've got Sid. So Sid's pretty cool. Having multiple effects, being a backup, being able to replace itself means that if you go with the first option of its modular abilities, you will be able to have a hypothetical 2-drop backup, and you'll be able to search through the top of your deck. But it will put cards into your break zone, which could help you. Let's say if you're playing Opus 2 Gold Bears with Archfiends, you'll be able to throw some Archfiends into your break zone pretty quickly. Or being able to give a power boost would not be too bad either. So if you're able to use Sid, and let's say, I mean, it's pretty costly to use Sid and start breaking it because it's a 4 cost, especially if you're trying to use that plus 3000 power. I don't advise it too much, but sometimes you just need to be able to finish it off, and having like you could say somewhat of a mini Gapal might be helpful to you. Okay. Next up, we've got Vermilion Bird. Let's see. So being able to enter the field and search out 4-cost summon or less and play it without paying the cost. Also getting the plus 1000 power, plus 1000 damage on top of that when you use fire summons. If you build your deck around fire summons, that's not too bad, but that comes at a very heavy cost. But sometimes that plus 1000 power makes a big difference. We're talking about being able to deal with some forwards that are pretty problematic for fire, for example. We're talking about the Light Warrior of Light from Opus 2. I mean, being able to go from a 9k to a 10k can be quite relevant in that case, if that card were to become more popular again. But for the most part, I think this card might be able to see play. Being able to, for example, use this card, go with using the 4 CP Phoenix, which is a 4 cost, and for example, returning the any kind of forwards you want from that, and dealing damage to multiple forwards. It could be interesting, it could be a combo, but we're talking about a 6 cost, meaning that either you play it out with your backups or from your hand, and sometimes with the fact that Mono Ice discard is still going to be pretty strong, it hasn't lost any tools or anything like that. 6 CP is a lot to ask for, and in terms of the 6 CP, sometimes I'm not quite sure if this card will be so backbreaking that it's something that you want to build your deck around. All right, next up we've got Dominion Legionary. So Dominion Legionary is able to, you could say, have a 2 CP reduction in cost because you're able to search a copy of itself. So for the first couple of copies, you'll be able to get extra ones. It's a standard unit. It's a multi-card, so you'll be able to have multiple copies of it. So if you're trying to build out your backups quickly, you'll be able to do so if you want to. And being able to break itself to make room for the backups. For example, if you built up too fast and you have important backups that you want to play afterwards, that's kind of cool. But a plus 1000 power boost to 1 attacking forward, not that great. So I'll have to wait and see if somebody can break this card, because otherwise I'm not too excited for it, especially not in constructed. When it comes to sealed, it is definitely nice to be able to curve out, but there's not that much recursion. So if you throw away too many cards to be able to play this, while you may be able to curve out a little bit better, you have to be very careful about which cards you discard, because otherwise you might not be able to get them back. And so this card comes at a fairly heavy cost to be able to do so. So be very careful about how you fill up your backup slots and which cards you discard to play it, and subsequent following copies of itself after you search them out. Next up, we've got Zelf. So Zelf's pretty cool. We talk about a 4-drop 4K haste. So that's pretty relevant. I mean, sometimes you just need one more forward to be able to deal the finishing blow. And it does come with a couple of abilities. You can only pick one of the two, though. So it's modular. It deal damage equal to Zelf's power. So unless Zelf enters the field with, or you stack a lot of power boost on top of it very quickly as the abilities on the stack, then it's not going to be able to deal with a lot of forwards. So keep that in mind. And but breaking a monster of cost 2 or less can be relevant, but it's very niche. So for constructed, I don't quite love it, and for sealed, I don't quite love it either, because unless they play a lot of forwards with 4,000 power or less, it's going to be hard for you to deal more than 4,000 power with the first ability. And for the second ability, unless they're playing monsters that cost 2 or less, it's not going to be that useful either. So be careful about that, as this card is very niche. Next up, we got Selfie. That was a card that we spoiled over in Kansas City from the break zone. Pretty interesting and constructed with seed candidates. So we definitely have Squall and Cypher as well. I think it was like Irvine and Zell. So there's definitely a couple of things you can do. And the Squall that's the seed candidate hasn't been very popular lately, but if you're able to block or attack with it or give it first strike, it'd be pretty relevant. Keep in mind that this card is a searcher, so it's always nice to keep track of those, and experts, so if you're kind of racing out against someone, this might help you out, but it's a little bit niche, so be careful when you use it. But when you're talking about sealed, this like the card advantage that you get from being able to play a backup on top of getting a forward back, a forward from your deck, can be relevant in terms of speed and in terms of utility, being able to search out exactly which one you need in case you have a multiple seed candidates, such as in the set Squall and Zell. Not really sure how relevant that will be, but it's something to keep in mind. Next up, we've got a 5-cost warrior, 9k. So in constructed, okay, when warrior attacks, warrior gets plus 2,000 power until end of turn. So technically 5-drop 11k, as long as you don't care, you want to race out your opponent, you're more aggressive, you're not as much of a stabilizing than attacking kind of deck, and your main goal is to actually go in and attack more often than blocking, then this becomes a 5-drop 11k, which is pretty darn good. On top of being a standard unit, being able to get a lot of boost from, let's say, Arc or the Warrior of Light from Water, from Opus 1. That's pretty cool. And when we're talking about sealed, it's a 9k. 9k is quite relevant, so I would definitely use it in sealed. Constructed, a little more niche, especially since it doesn't have haste or anything like that. So while it can be difficult to deal with, it might not be good enough at times. Okay. Next up, we've got Soldier. So Soldier is pretty nice. I like it. Well, actually, 3-drop 7k multi-card, being able to boost itself, but it comes at a very heavy cost. We're talking about 2 every time you want to boost it, and it doesn't have a restriction on it, so you'll be able to do it multiple times. So that's kind of niche, and it's pretty costly to be able to do so in constructed. When we talk about sealed, this card is okay. Just 3-drop 7k, that's okay. And then sometimes being able to boost yourself past your opponents is going to be nice. I think it's a pretty good card for sealed. Constructed, maybe not so much. All right, next up we've got Dark Load, which was spoiled during the Toronto Crystal Cup. Interesting card, 3-drop 8k, so that's pretty good, but in constructed, 3-drop 8Ks don't quite cut in most of the time. There's definitely a decent amount of 3-drop 8Ks that have come around with no real detriment. And this one does come with a little bit of a problem, which is to take the top 10 cards of your deck, to remove the top 10 cards from your deck from the game. And so since it doesn't go into your break zone, you don't really get to use this with, for example, like the Archfiend Goldbest deck. So that's not that great. And to just get an 8k power out of 3 costs. While it's cool, it's just not quite enough to push it over the top in terms of constructed. Now the second ability being during the beginning of your attack phase, choose up to 1/4, deal 3,000 damage. That works kind of like Wall, where this is not let's say conditional trigger or a mate effect, as you could say. So every time it's your attack phase, you actually it doesn't ask you choose. Actually, it does say choose up to. So if you don't choose any, then you can skip it. So be careful about that. If you want to take make use of its effect, you may miss it. Just like I guess Warrior of Light, you could miss it as well. 3,000 isn't relevant enough, in my opinion. There's not enough forwards that are 3,000 power that I want to get rid of that quickly. At least not to that cost. And when we're talking about sealed, that's even worse, because in sealed normally you have 40 cards and you're taking 1/4 of your deck out. And if we're talking about, let's say you're able to do this turn 1, then that means you drew 5 cards, or at least 5 cards to begin with, plus 1 more card, so that's 6 cards. If you're playing second, that's 7 cards. And so there's a possibility that you're already at 36 cards in your deck. If you're player 1, if you're player 2, that's 33. And then you take another 10, then that goes to like 20 something. You're definitely putting yourself on the clock. You have 10 turns to win the game. Otherwise, you will lose by decking yourself. So be very careful about this card. Until I see something with more synergy for this card, I probably would not be playing it. Next up, we have Bahamut. So X Burst makes it always relevant. Dealing 10,000 damage to a forward is good, but keep in mind that I believe, let's see, cards with damage. And having to deal yourself 1 point of damage works if you're a very aggressive deck, just like some aggressive decks like to play, for example, Genesis for in ice decks. Bahamut's going to be able to get rid of most forwards, as very few forwards have, let's say, immunity from all damage from spells, from summons, or are large enough to deal with it. I mean, there are certain problematic cards such as Ishtola or Dalaluma, where yes, you may be able to break a Dalaluma, but your opponent will be able to deal 2 instances of 4k damage to your forward. So be very careful about that, and you won't be able to get any X-Burst effects from this on top of it, and so be very careful about it. It's possible to be useful, but there's a possibility that it could I mean, it feels like there's so many restrictions on it that it might hurt. And in sealed, this could win you the game definitely, but you only have 6 points of life, so you can only take 6 damage in sealed. So be very careful, as once you're on their 5th point, this card is no longer usable. You don't have to use it every time you get into your damage zone, but if you're not using it when it gets to your damage zone, that means this card is no longer useful to you. So be very careful about this card. It's kind of cool sometimes. If you aggro out hard early, then this is good, but otherwise, then maybe not quite as much. All right. Next up, we've got Neo Bahamut. So another Bahamut. So this one can only be played during your main phase, no X Burst, dealing 8,000 damage, discard your whole hand. So if you're playing a deck where you might not have many cards in hand, this is pretty cool. But other than that, I mean, it's discarding your whole hand when you're trying to kind of build out. So it works much better in aggressive decks than not. And 8,000 damage is pretty cool, but sometimes might not quite be enough, so be careful. In Constructed, I don't advise using it too much unless your deck is fully aggro, where you intend to have no cards in hand anyways. And in Sealed, sometimes it could win you the game, but so I think this card is useful if it's going to help you finish off the game, as most decks might not be so tuned that they have multiple answers during one turn to be able to take care of all your combat tricks. And so this card could be useful in Sealed, but not quite as much in Constructed unless you go really heavy on the aggro. Alright, I'm going to flip this card over because I actually don't have the other card at the moment. The card being Farian, so it's already been spoiled if anybody already knows about it. So Furion is a 4 cost, 8,000 power forward, Job Rebel from Final Fantasy II, and if you control a Job Rebel forward, the cost of Furion is reduced by 2, so it'd be a 2 cost 8k, which is really good. But it needs to be forward, so maybe like Guy, for example, or Maria, people like that would work, or even the rare bards that has all the jobs would also work as well. If your opponent controls 3 or more forwards, Furion gains plus 1,000 power and haste. So that's pretty nice if, for example, your opponent was able to rebuild faster than you after a board wipe, put 3 forwards or more. Furion might be able to kind of, let's say, sneak in a point of damage if they went all out against you. For example, if you're playing against, for example, a monsters deck. Well, actually, not really. Monsters, let's see. Lena, Knights, things like that. Well, I don't know how relevant the second ability will be, but there's a possibility. And if you put a backup into your break zone, Furion gains first strike and brave until end of turn. I don't know how I feel about this card altogether. It is pretty cool, and I might be missing out on some interactions which would make it stronger. But other than that, I don't really love breaking my own backups just to give a first strike and haste, or first strike and brave to Furion. So I don't know how useful it would be, but I mean, it's okay. I would gladly be, I'd be happy if somebody proved me wrong. Next up, we have Mont Blanc, which is pretty interesting. It is a heroic though. 2 cost backup that's able to give 1/4 to deal 2,000 damage to a forward based on how many Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced 2 forwards you control. So it's very, let's say, niche in that case, where you have to have Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced 2 category characters out. It is a Moogle though, so if you play a Moogle deck, that'll be pretty useful. But the fact that you have to, there's so many conditions. You need to have category 2 forwards to be able to use the ability at all, and you will most likely want to have another fire backup on top of having this one to be able to use its ability without having to discard cards for it. So it's a little bit picky. I'll have to wait and see if it's that relevant. At least for constructed, it's going to be kind of, there's a possibility that a deck comes out that's going to work with it. In sealed, I don't know. It's a little tough. It's a 2 CP backup, so that's kind of cool with an ability that you might be able to play, but don't really know how I feel about that. And I believe, yeah, last but not least for fire, we've got Ruby Dragon. So it feels a little bit inferior to the Lightning Dragon, but in terms of like, I wouldn't really use it in constructed, but in sealed, being able to deal 8,000 power can be very relevant. So be able to do that and maybe play it out earlier on to get to officially get played out with CP, so you don't have to discard too many cards to play it out, is pretty nice, and be able to use it right away is nice too. But I would use it in sealed, definitely. 8,000 power is a fairly 8,000 damage is a fairly relevant number, and it might be able to help you win the game. So this card is pretty good in sealed. So thank you very much for tuning in for the fire, I guess you could say, reveal of Opus 6. Hopefully you enjoy going to your pre-release, and we'll try to come back soon to give you other reveals for Opus 6. So hopefully you enjoy yourselves. I'm Lauren from the Break Zone, and keep in mind that our major shout out to our sponsor too, MagicTechGames.com, as they will be selling Opus 6 when people trade in cards to them, as well as when Opus 6 becomes boxes become available to the public. And you're also able to make use of their trade-in option if you want to. If you have cards from different opuses and you have multiple copies that you don't need, feel free to go ahead, take a look at our at the buy list, and trade in some cards and get some Opus 6 boxes instead, because this set is going to be pretty cool. On top of the fact that it is a set that you might want to focus on if you want to qualify for the North American Championship or Worlds, in case you're from a different country. And being able to get Opus 6 cards would be pretty nice, as some of these cards are pretty amazing. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next. Oh, go ahead and feel free to leave comments and questions down below. We'll try to answer them as much as we can in a timely manner. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time.